Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
You're listening to Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. I'm your host, Rob Port. If I sound distracted, it's because I've been busy covering this story all morning. I'm joined by my co-host, Chad Oban.
He's right of center, I'm left of center, both sides of the political spectrum.
I think it's cathartic. I think it's a necessary and proper debate. I'm glad we're having it.
And honestly, we have to do better.
Okay, I don't know why I'm getting blamed for this, right? Today we're going to talk about property taxes. So the Tax Foundation, now they're a national group. They're a nonprofit. I would say they have, and Jared Walczak is our guest. He is the director for state projects for the Tax Foundation. I would say generally has a right of center view on taxation policy. Jared, is that fair?
You know, I let other people define that, but we're focused on tax efficiency. We want economic growth out of a good, well-structured tax system.
My experience is that generally you want broad tax bases and low taxes.
Absolutely.
I consider that right of center. We're not going to have that debate, but I think that's very interesting. But the reason why we're having Jared on is a couple of his colleagues at the Tax Foundation had an article. The headline is North Dakota considers eliminating property taxes. Very interesting. This is one of the hottest debates of our election cycle. Property taxes have been one of the most contentious debates in North Dakota for just about the entirety of my career writing about politics in North Dakota. So it's been a while. I'm going to read a quote from the article. It says, quote, a constitutional initiative on North Dakota's ballot would prohibit all tax on real or personal property based on assessed value except to pay for bonded indebtedness, which could make North Dakota the first state without property taxes. Theoretically, lawmakers could adopt a new mechanism to tax property, such as a square footage model for real property, though the alternatives are flawed and unrealistic. Well, if I could editorialize a little bit, it's not like the politicians have ever let flawed and unrealistic stop them. But they continue. Repealing the property taxes is an idea with obvious appeal, but it's a choice that could come back to haunt North Dakotans. Now, Jared, I guess that's my first question. Why, if North Dakotans approved Measure 4, why could it come back and haunt them?
It's a great question. Firstly, it's a lot of money. We're talking about over $3 billion over a biennium. Essentially, that's as much as the individual income tax and the sales tax bring in combined. So if you were going to offset that with other taxes, you're talking about potentially doubling your other major taxes at the state level. And the property tax, we can talk about why people don't like it. And there's some good reasons why people don't like the property tax. But from an economist's point of view, it's a very efficient tax. It doesn't distort the economy in the same way as other taxes do. It doesn't impact economic growth in the same way. So if you are eliminating the property tax and maybe doubling your other major state level taxes to compensate for that, you're going to be doing some serious harm to your state's economy. And no one else has done this for pretty good reasons.
So, Jared, you did a presentation before the North Dakota legislature, I think last week, maybe it was the week before, talking about this proposal. Can you talk a little bit about where North Dakota ranks in terms of states around us, average compared to the country, in terms of property taxes, in terms of overall tax sort of structures in the state? Just sort of give the listeners a feel for where North Dakota is at the beginning of this debate.
Absolutely. So North Dakota ACE's average effective rates on property of about 0.97%, just under 1% the value of your property you pay in property taxes every year. That's slightly lower than the national average. It's about typical in the immediate region, very similar to South Dakota, very similar to Minnesota, lower than Iowa, higher than Montana. Yeah, you can look around and it's not an unusual amount. What's a big deal for everyone right now is it doesn't matter what your effective rates are. If your assessed values have soared over the last few years, and for almost everyone across the country, that is the case, then even with the same effective rates, you're paying a whole lot more. And the solution to that, local officials can roll back the millages. They can have lower rates on your property so that you're not paying that dramatic additional amount. But when that doesn't happen, and frankly, across the country, we haven't seen it happen enough, people are paying a lot more. And there's legitimate frustration. There's legitimate concern. There's, I think, a very valid desire to see state policymakers do something about it. That doesn't necessarily mean repeal the property tax, but that's obviously what's in the wind right now with Measure 4.
One thing you talked about, like doubling, but if we get rid of the property tax and then Measure 4 obligates the legislature to replace that revenue, but kind of leaves it up to them. So you're suggesting, well, that could lead to, obviously it's going to lead to upward pressure on our other statewide taxes. But I'm wondering, like, what's our capacity to replace that? Because our state sales taxes, when you look at, obviously we have the state sales tax, which is 5%, and then we have various local sales taxes on top of that. And I looked at sales taxes late last year across the state, and a lot of, and especially in the high commerce areas where there is a lot of stuff, because with some of our rural areas, there's just not a lot of sales tax, there's not a lot of commerce happening. In the commerce centers in particular, they've already tacked on 2-3 extra percent. So you're talking about, a sales tax rate that's up around 7.5% in some parts of the state, particularly the high commerce areas. What is even our capacity to be able to replace those revenues? But I don't know that we really can raise the sales tax any higher without pretty devastating economic consequences.
It would be extremely unbalanced. There are just practical limits on how much you can raise any one tax. There's a reason why states use.
There's a point at which consumers are just I'm going to go somewhere else, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. People will drive across borders where they can to purchase, especially larger items. You might not do it for everyday items, but when you're buying that appliance, you might drive across state lines because it's going to be a whole lot cheaper. And some people are just going to look and say, I don't want this, that I don't want to live in a state that has a sales tax that's that high, especially if I don't feel like I'm receiving some of the other benefits. There are limits on how high you can go, but there are only so many other sources of revenue. And local governments rely pretty much exclusively on the property tax in much of the country. You've got local sales taxes, but the property tax is the largest source of local tax revenue nationwide. 72% of all local tax revenue comes from the property tax. And that's why no one has ever really seriously considered eliminating it. We've had some on the margins, sort of more fringe movements to do that. North Dakota has previously had a ballot measure that was pretty resoundingly rejected to do this. But right now, this is a much more active conversation. It's not just North Dakota, although Measure 4 is the furthest along in this discussion. But the dramatic rise in property values over the last few years, we're talking about a 50% average nationwide increase over the last 3.5-4 years. That's causing a conversation that I understand where it's coming from. I think it's heading in the wrong direction. There's a reason why every state has property taxes, why in the entire history of this country, really in the history of pretty much every country, we have always had property taxes. It is one of the very few constants. You basically cannot find a place pretty much ever with government that doesn't have taxes on real property. And while I don't want to defer and say because we've done something in the past, we must continue to do it, I think we do need to have a little bit of humility to say that for thousands of years, we've said this is a pretty good tax, and maybe we shouldn't just throw it out in one election.
Right. Particularly when there's no plan to replace it. When we're talking, I had somebody yesterday said it's like jumping out of an airplane without checking your parachute, or, because we just don't know what's going to replace that money. So the proponents of this claim that this is going to be just an economic great thing for North Dakotans, that people are going to be flooding to North Dakota to fill our jobs, all those kind of things. What would you say to that? Do you think that's a realistic sort of perspective, that this is somehow going to make North Dakota a destination for all the people?
It's not. That is ultimately not what is going to drive economic decision-making or migration. And we have a pretty good economic literature on this. And I don't want to bore you with some of the studies, but I just want to summarize some of this. Now, People really dislike property taxes, and partly they dislike them because they are so transparent compared to other taxes you pay. I love transparency, but I wish it were the case with all taxes. With the property tax, you probably know what you pay in property taxes every year. If I asked you what you paid in sales taxes last year, I don't think anyone can give an answer on that, probably not even close. Even income taxes, surprisingly, given withholding, people don't often know what they paid in state income taxes.
Well, people usually know what they get back in a refund.
They do, and they sometimes think that like the larger the refund, the better for them, but that really means you overpaid in the first place. So there's this misunderstanding on how a lot of that works, and the property tax, you feel, and you dislike it, and I get that. But when we look at the evidence, we see that here's one major study that involved, I think, over 24 countries over like a couple decades, a 1 percentage point shift from income taxes to sales taxes improved GDP by about 0.75 of a percentage point. Shifting from income taxes to property taxes increased GDP by about 1.5 percentage points, twice as much. Basically, what you're saying is the property tax is better for economic growth. Other studies sort of see the same thing. The gross state product is going to decrease when the income tax replaces the property tax. One study saw a 2.8 percentage point decrease in gross state product. Household income is going to decline by about 3.5%, according to that study. Other studies look at employment rates, and they see that property taxes have basically no real effect on employment rates, but income taxes and sales taxes and other taxes have a negative effect on employment rates. Because the property tax is on an immovable asset. When you tax property, the land can't go anywhere. You can make decisions about what you build on it, but actually the property tax also funds the sort of things that makes your property more valuable. And you can't say that about a lot of taxes. The income tax pays for a lot of things. They're really important, but a lot of them are transfers. They don't necessarily benefit every individual taxpayer, certainly not proportionally. When you pay property tax to your local government, you're paying for things that are really important for the value of your property. And we actually find it sort of passes what's called the benefit test, where there's a pretty strong correlation between what you're paying and what you receive in benefits, or at least in the capitalization into the value of your property. So it doesn't distort economic decision-making. It doesn't change behavior. And I know this all seems very abstract and abstruse and like, who cares? But it matters. It matters for your economy.
Anything abstruse. I mean, I think everybody understands if you own a home in a good school district, your home's worth more.
Absolutely.
If you own your home in a low crime area, it's worth more. And how do we fund police and schools? The property tax, at least a significant portion of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely the point. And, so many times I hear people say, well, what if I don't have kids in school? It's like, but you own a home in a place with a good school district. You have benefits from that, even if you don't have children in school. And if you have a higher value home, and you're going to care more even about the value and the services you receive, the roads, the police, the fire protection, all of that. This actually influences the value of your property. And that means that economically, it's going to do far less to distort economic decision-making. You're not going to say, I'm going to change my behavior because of the tax. And that matters. We want taxes to raise revenue with the least amount of economic distortion. And the income tax is a tax on labor force participation. It's a tax on investment. The sales tax is a tax on consumption, which is actually pretty good, but a very significant portion of it actually falls on production rather than consumption, because it's taxed on those intermediate transactions as part of the production process. That's bad. You're hurting the decision to invest and to do business in North Dakota. The property tax has very few of those effects. I mean, any tax is going to have some effects, obviously, but you can't get a whole lot better than the property tax for a major source of revenue in terms of relatively little economic impact. So if you take $3 billion worth of property taxes over a biennium and you put them into almost anything else, you're going to be very disruptive to your economy. You're not growing the economy, you're shrinking the economy.
So talk to me a little bit about efficiency, because that's one thing that the Tax Foundation, in addition to these other factors, the efficiency of the tax. And I think sometimes in this debate, that gets overlooked. Now, one of the things I do appreciate about the property taxes, although I don't enjoy paying mine any more than anybody else, I like that it is very local, and it's very tied to paying the tax to very local people for very specific things. As you said, I get a statement every year, and it says, this is what I paid for parks, this is what I paid for the city, this is what I paid for the county, and I like that. So it seems like if we do shift away from the property tax, we're shifting to a more, what's the right word for it? I don't know, dispersed tax base. And generally broader tax bases are fine, but I don't, to speak a little bit about that need to connect the people doing the taxing with the people doing the spending.
Yes, there's a couple of different elements here. One is just the redistributive nature of different types of taxes. When we talk about income taxes, for instance, how much you're paying has very little to do with how much benefit you are receiving from the state. You're receiving a benefit as a taxpayer, as someone who lives in the state, but it has very little to do with how much you're paying. And to some degree, okay, that's fine. We need to pay for various social services. The income tax does that. But when you pay property taxes, like you said, there's a very close connection between the value you are receiving locally from your community, that this is being invested in things that actually improve your quality of life personally and do so roughly proportionally with the value of the property you own. So firstly, that's a really good thing. It makes sense to have at least some elements of the tax code that look like that. The other aspect is, again, sort of this idea, whatever you tax, you get less of. You tax income, to some degree, you're getting less income. And that means you are not only taking some income out of the productive sector of the economy through the tax, but you are changing the incentives and the ability to invest. You are changing the return on labor. So you're driving up the cost of employing someone. You're driving up the cost of doing business. You are driving down the after-tax income that an individual gets from working. So that may change their decision to work more on the margin or to seek different employment. All of this, on the whole, reduces productivity in the state. A sales tax that has a lot of business inputs in it, which yours does, most states do, that's going to reduce the incentive to put capital investment in the state rather than somewhere else. Those things are less efficient. We want the least amount of economic drag with every dollar we raise in taxes. And the property tax has very little economic drag. These other taxes have significantly more. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't other cases for having these other taxes, but there is a good case for not eliminating this very important revenue stream that doesn't have those implications.
Jared, I know you said you don't like to identify the ideology, that you let that other people do that, but I did look at your board of directors. So it's a pretty conservative board of directors, including conservative members of Congress. One of the things that drives me crazy about this measure is the folks that are pushing it say that they're the conservatives in this conversation. And I will tell you, I was in Killdeer, North Dakota last night, where there was a group of people talking about Measure 4. And there were state legislators there was county commissioners there was city commissioners there, having a conversation about what's best for their community and how this would affect it. As a group that may or may not be conservative, is there anything conservative about centralizing all decisions at the state level?
Not in my opinion. So let me speak to conservatives, to people who say, I don't like the property tax because I'm a conservative or maybe more libertarian leaning. And I think usually one of the arguments you hear is, if I own my property, why am I paying on it? Do I really own it if I'm paying? And I would say you're paying for the services you're receiving. You're paying for ongoing services to that property, not for the fact of your ownership of that property. And those expenses are ongoing. You would expect to continue to pay for them. Imagine, I mentioned this to the legislature, this is like a weird hypothetical, but imagine some like libertarian utopia where government does almost nothing and you have to go purchase all these services, that you're paying a fee for your roads directly, and you are seeking out insurance contracts to make sure that you have police and fire protection or their equivalents and all of these things. When you take out insurance, do you pay more for a higher value property? You do, because it's worth more. And there's more cost associated with protecting it, and you get more value out of it, out of the services you're receiving. The property tax works the same way. And you would have to go pay for all of those things if government wasn't providing them. Now, the government's going to be the most efficient provider, not the government's perfectly efficient, but obviously we don't want go get this in the private sector. But just that thought experiment, even if you are the most libertarian person out there, at some point you would have to pay for these services. You would still need them. It doesn't matter if you own the property, you're going to pay for them. And we could ask the sort of same questions. If you would say, well, I don't own my property if I have to pay property taxes on it. Do you own your income? Do you own your labor if you pay income taxes? Do you own your income and your labor if you have to pay sales taxes? I mean, you can ask that question sort of anywhere that we have taxes. And as long as we have gotten past this like first hurdle of can there be taxes, which most of us have gotten beyond, I don't think you can really distinguish the property tax from most of those other taxes. And then we think about, this is a very local tax. And this is a tax that's not very redistributive. We are paying for things that have been approved at the local level by people who are elected very close to the people, providing services that benefit people very broadly. If you have a sort of localist, conservative case for what taxes and what government should look like, this is probably it. Having the state government raise all of this and then redistribute it across jurisdictions with all the strings that can potentially be attached to that in the future, that doesn't look nearly as conservative. And also, conservatives generally care about the state not meddling too much. If you don't want the state picking winners and losers, putting a thumb on the scale, making your economic decisions for you, then you want the tax that has the least impact on economic choices. And that's going to be the property tax.
You talked about like this theoretical libertarian utopia where you have to like pay for fire protection. That's not like we did that in America. In fact, you can still go to some of the, New England communities like Boston, whatever, and you'll see little emblems on the outside of the house. And those emblems indicated which fire protection the owner of the house paid for. And so they would show up and the firefighters would check to make sure you had an emblem before they would put your fire out because you had to pay for it privately. That's not theoretically. We did that. We stopped doing it because it didn't work very well. Let me go. I will tell you, when I read this article from the Tax Foundation, the part where they said that theoretically lawmakers could adopt a new mechanism to tax property such as square footage, but those alternatives are. I felt a little attacked because I have been trying to make the case that Measure 4 doesn't really abolish property taxes. It abolishes one very specific type of property taxes, which is a tax on value of real estate. What it leaves possible, and this is my question for you, is because I think a lot of other states do this, although not as knowledgeable as you are. There's a real potential that we could see our current property tax replaced with a new property tax that says, well, if you have a fishing boat, you have to pay X number of dollars, or if you have a camper, you have to pay X number of dollars. That's a property tax too. Do other states do that? I mean, are there other states that are doing property taxes that aren't taxes on property value? How common is that? And how likely is it that North Dakota could go down that road if we have to replace the current property tax?
So that's not common as at least a significant portion of what we consider the property tax. We do have personal property taxes on things like boats and cars in a fair number of states. They are generally based on a valuation of that, which would be prohibited here. You do have license fees as well. I mean, sometimes there's just a flat license fee. If you own a car, you pay X amount, and that's usually in addition to the property tax. And North Dakota can clearly do that under, even if this passed, they could raise those dramatically if they wanted to. They could do other taxes on homes. I mean, if we want to go back to what happened a few centuries ago, we used to have things called window taxes or hearth taxes because it was really that hard in the old days to value a property. So you just counted the number of windows, and that was sort of a proxy for the value of a house.
That's actually like if you've seen pictures of like Paris, and you have all these beautiful houses, and they have these like mansard. I think that's what it's called, but like
the mansard roof.
Yeah, the roofs. That was actually done because France was taxing based on the number of stories in your house. But if you did that roof, you could tack on another story to your house and not pay taxes.
Right. And there are homes in the UK where windows were bricked up because that reduced the tax value, and homes where they consolidated the hearth so that, multiple rooms shared one chimney to try to avoid this. So you get some weird distortion of behavior, obviously, but also it's just really bad. The number of windows is not a great proxy, especially once it becomes the way you're taxing because you'll work around it. It's not a great proxy for the value of your home. But in the 1700s, we did that because assessment's hard. Now, of course, we can do this much better. So we've chosen to do that. We could find another proxy. I'm sure it wouldn't be windows, but you could do square footage. You could do something else. Every one of these would be worth.
I don't know if you know this, the West Fargo lawmaker, State Representative Ben Koppelman, we actually had him on the podcast, is proposing a square footage tax. Like he's working on a bill draft.
And I get why you would do that if you don't have the option of doing it on market value, assessed value. I get it. But, this is going to a worse system. And sometimes your choices are constrained and you have nothing left and you have to take the best that's available to you. But that's what voters need to understand when they're going to the polls, is that they are taking one of the better options out there and taking it off the table, and whatever replaces it, whether it's an income tax, whether it is still a property tax, but one that is much worse calibrated, it's going to be worse than what you have now.
Jared, I think, obviously the three of us, I think Hope Measure 4 goes down. I think the three of us also understand people are mad about property taxes in this state, and that's not going away unless something substantial gets done during the next legislative session. So if you were advising the legislature on what they should be doing, what would you suggest that the legislature do to sort of get their arms around? Because they've invested, right? I mean, they've sent money down to the political subs, and people aren't feeling it, even though the numbers sometimes say they should. But, I don't think people are feeling it.
No, I agree they aren't. And I think credits especially, they feel different, right? You give your property tax and you have the credits, and you don't really think of the net of them. You just think about your property tax. So it's a lot of money, and it doesn't necessarily alleviate people's concerns. I think levy limits or revenue limits are the most appropriate way to do this, for a jurisdiction to be forced essentially to calculate every year based on the properties that existed last year and the valuation increases that they have seen. How much additional revenue would we generate? And then to say, we've got a cap. We can only grow our revenue from all of those properties in aggregate by inflation plus X amount. Legislature can set what that number is. And above that, we need to roll back the rates, the millages, so that we keep collections constrained, so we don't have massive growth from year to year. This is an aggregate revenue limit. It's limiting the growth of tax collections in the jurisdiction. It is not a per property, per parcel limit, which is what an assessment limit is. And the reason for that is assessment limits create a lot of distortions. They say that if you buy your home and keep it forever, you can pay very little in property taxes, and someone new coming in has to pay all the property taxes because you're paying next to nothing. It creates a lock-in effect where you don't want to sell, because if you do, you're going to have this much higher tax burden. Or if you improve your property substantially, do maintenance and repairs, you're going to trigger something. Assessment limits, that's California style, Prop 13 style, they create often a housing crisis. You don't want to do that, but it makes sense to limit the growth of property taxes. If your assessed value has risen, let's say 30% higher than inflation over the last 4 years, you probably didn't want 30% more government. You're probably not getting 30% better government. You're saying, I've got the same house. Why am I paying so much more? And that is a really legitimate question. Those millages should roll back.
And also that gain in value is not realized unless you sell your house. And you can actually sell it for what the government says it's assessed for, which is sometimes not always the case. I think that is one of the most confounding things about this, is a lot of times you'll hear the locals say, well, we kept the mill levy steady, or we even lowered mills. It's just the valuations went up. And it's like, well, you do control the rate, though. Like, you could bring it down. Like, you don't have to just say, oh, we just got this windfall. Whoops. You could do something about it. They're just not. And I think there does seem to be a growing consensus. We had a Democratic legislative leader on a while ago, Representative Zach Ista from Grand Forks, who said that, he's talking about caps. Republican lawmakers I'm talking to are talking about caps. It does seem like that's where we're heading. Are you thinking, because I was talking to a statewide official, and one of the things they said is, caps are hard to implement, though. We need some sort of a pressure relief valve. And I think that's probably right. Like, a community that runs into an emergent situation or an unusual situation, I agree with that. So would it be something like there's a cap, and then if you want to exceed the cap, you got to go to the voters, something like that?
Yes. So most levy limits that already exist have a number of things that are outside. So if there's like a court judgment or something against the jurisdiction, usually they're allowed to raise additional revenue just automatically. And if they need to spend beyond the caps limitations, typically there is a voter override process. And what we've seen actually is the voters pretty frequently approve those, but that local officials are much more prudent about when they bring them to the voters. If you have a good reason, you'll take it and you'll make your case, but you won't just automatically every year take the massive increase because, hey, there was no vote on it. You just keep it, to your point of, we'll just keep the mill levy the same and collect so much more revenue. If you have to go to the voters to ask for that, you're going to wait until there's a justification. And then the voters may well say yes.
Yeah, like we need a new school, or hey, our parks could use a boost. I mean, whatever it is, you go make your case to the voters. Jared, anything else? I mean, any final thoughts for North Dakota voters as they're considering this? Because there are a lot of North Dakotans who are upset about this, and I do think that's a message everybody agrees on. Is whatever happens with Measure 4, if it fails, we can't just walk away from this issue. I mean, there's got to be reform. So what's your message to voters as they're considering this?
Well, I think voters have already sent a message to lawmakers that they care about property tax relief just by the fact that this is on the ballot. But sending a message and fundamentally altering your tax code are two different things. And ballot measures are always challenging. They are short. They do massive things, and then they leave all the details up to someone else. And this is too much detail to leave up to the legislature. It binds them in, I think, almost impossible ways. The property tax is a good tax. You may not love it, but you will not like the alternatives better. There needs to be property tax relief. There needs to be mechanisms to ensure that people's property tax burdens do not continue to rise the way they have. But it's really throwing the baby out with the bathwater to say, let's become the first state, really pretty much the first government in like the modern world to go without a property tax. That's a pretty risky place to be.
I'm still not convinced that we would actually go without a property tax.
You have a point.
I feel like they're just going to find a new and dumber ways to tax our property. But we're going to leave it there.
That is fair.
Jared, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Great information.
Thank you for having me.
The cold cases you see at the Vault have captivated readers across our region for years. At the Vault podcast, our team of professional reporters takes you further into those stories with new interviews from family members, investigators, and experts. Check out The Vault at inforum.com/The Vault and subscribe to The Vault wherever you find your podcasts.
I thought that was a very good discussion about property taxes. And the thing I like about it is so much of our political conversation these days is just bombast, and that wasn't. Like, that's just, I think he makes some really good points. I don't know, when he says the property tax is a good tax, I think frustration with the property tax in North Dakota is running so high. I don't know that that's the message, but I understand the point he's making, which is, what do we replace it with? Like, nobody enjoys paying their property tax, but what do you replace it with? You know, we're either going to replace it with another stupid way to tax your property, or we're going to raise our income taxes ridiculous amounts, or we're going to raise our sales tax a ridiculous amount, or more likely, we're going to have more fees, and we're going to have more income tax, and we're going to have more sales tax, all of which are going to be very disruptive to our economy. I thought it was a great argument against Measure 4. There are reasons to be frustrated with your property taxes. Those are completely valid. Measure 4 is not the solution.
Yeah, I thought the conversation was very interesting. You're right. He didn't bring sort of the emotion and the personality that maybe sometimes get brought into these debates. I like how he said, "Oh, let other people define if we're right of center." They're right of center. Yeah, there's no doubt they're right of Kevin Brady.
Yeah, I understand. Like they want to. They're just trying to provide straight information. And
left of center groups would say the same thing, right? I mean, but he was a straight shooter on this thing. I think that the fact that he recognizes people are mad about property taxes and that valuations, I think one of the slides he gave to the legislature, and maybe he referenced this, they've gone up 50% across the whole country in the last, several years. Montana's experienced a huge issue with property taxes. I mean, so this isn't just a North Dakota issue. But again, when we're the first, we don't want to be first on this one.
No.
In terms of, let's figure it out after we jump out of the plane.
And let's be honest. Like the rise in housing, the rise in property values is really tied to what's going on with housing, which is just that there's not enough of it. So because there's scarcity, rents are going up, values are going up, and then of course we're paying more in property taxes because those values go up. But it's so hard because it's for most of us, it's not realized value. Most of us are flipping our homes, whenever the value goes up. Most of us are living in them for most of our lives. So it's just the only thing we're seeing is a bigger bill, and not even that is another thing that frustrates me is, just because valuations went up doesn't mean that a local government had a need for that additional revenue. And I really think as we talk more and more about this, I feel like we're starting to coalesce around the idea that we need a mechanism that's going to tie what locals collect in property taxes to real local needs. And I like the idea of a cap with a pressure relief valve that says if you want to go above the cap, you got to go to the voters and you got to make your case for a specific need.
So one of the things that he talked about that I thought he framed really well is this idea, I don't have kids in school, or I don't use that road or what. And you hear that a lot, right? I've been in my house for 30 years. My kids don't go to school. But when he talked about what a good neighborhood means for your asset, right? If you have a home in a good neighborhood and a safe neighbor, you do personally benefit from that, even if your kid isn't going to school or going to that park or whatever. And I think that's because usually I just say to those people, we live in a society, for God's sakes, you should be part of this. That probably doesn't work as well as his point that he made.
I actually think that this is a place where when you bring in the glinty-eyed capitalists and just draw it down. I mean, yes, the idea of having good schools to educate our children, that's a very nice idea. Sometimes for some people, it can be a little nebulous. But what's not nebulous is your home is worth less if you have a giant pothole in front of your driveway. Yeah. Right? Your home is worth less if your insurance is through the roof because you don't have good fire protection. Your home is worth less if there's crimes happening in your neighborhood all the time.
Right. Yeah. So I agree, looking at this from a capitalist perspective. And that's the interesting thing, again, about Measure 4 is you have people coming at it from so many different angles on why it's not good policy. And he really dove into that. This is just not good policy. This isn't about property tax being good or bad. This is just not good policy. And I thought, it was good that he did that. And, again, I appreciate him coming in, maybe as somebody who's from the outside looking in at North Dakota or looking at other states and sort of giving a perspective on things. So I enjoyed that interview. I thought it was real good stuff.
One thing that he said is the amount that we collect in property taxes, it's not an unusual amount. Like North Dakota's not out on some, and I think sometimes you can slice and dice the numbers to make it seem like we are, and I think maybe sometimes those ignore the other ways in which other states tax locally. But we're not an outlier on this. It's not like this is I don't want to say that the property tax isn't a problem in North Dakota, but we're not some outlier. Like we're not an acute problem. Certainly not an outlier to the point that would justify us becoming not just the first in the country, but the first in the developed world.
Yeah,
to do away with the property tax.
One of the things at play there is the idea that people hear about the different rainy day funds that we have. We have all this money and maybe just not understanding what those rainy day funds are for and how big they actually are in terms of the size of government. So I think you do have people who, my property taxes went up 10%. I'm paying nothing in income taxes, right? I mean, that's the other thing. We pay virtually nothing in all these other taxes. So what else is left to be pissed about?
Yeah.
Property tax.
But I think if you're a conservative, maybe it's okay that we don't pay, and you and I can have a debate about what the income tax should be, but maybe it's okay that we don't pay much in income tax and we pay more locally to the people who are local. That flows directly. When I pay the property tax in Ward County, it doesn't go to Montreal County. It stays in Ward County where I live. And it gets used on Ward County issues like the sheriff's department or what have you.
And we would disagree with that a little bit. I think we're probably a little bit out of whack in terms of income versus property compared to sales. But I mean, again, just lopping off one leg completely in terms of property tax. And more importantly, the only one that locals get to set other than sales.
Well, I think your argument for higher income taxes would be to fund state priorities, not higher income taxes to then shovel the money down locally. We just don't want that.
Yeah, we do have this sort of thing where what are state priorities versus local priorities? I would say public education is both, right?
Sure. And we do fund it both. I mean, we do fund it both ways. I mean,
exactly right. And so I think that if you have a higher income tax, you might be able to fund more education.
The one thing that does give me pause about what we've been doing with the income taxes is just I want to make sure that we're ready for the day when oil tax revenues aren't one out of every $2 deposited in our state treasury.
Rob, it wasn't that long ago when prices were below zero.
Right.
Oil, and so that is a good concern.
Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. There was a debate last night.
Right. The only debates I pay attention are the ones that we moderate.
Yeah. No, you listened to it on the radio. I watched it. You said that Trump sounded worse with just the audio. I'm telling you, he didn't look good either. And there's going to be people out there who are going to say, oh, Port and Oban don't like Donald Trump. Therefore, of course, they're going to think he didn't do good. I think we've demonstrated a willingness when Donald Trump is getting traction or he's doing things that will work electorally. I mean, I think we're good at sort of setting aside our personal preferences and just saying, listen, that's going to work. That's going to sway people. His debate last night was objectively bad. And I think there's even a lot of people in Trump. I mean, there is probably not a more egregious Trump bootlicker than Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. And Lindsey Graham called it a train wreck or a disaster, some words to those effect. It was bad. It was a bad debate for him.
Yeah, and frankly, I think you and I have the ability to take off the blinders more than many Trump supporters do with watching something like that. The reality was Kamala Harris was more prepared, understood the issues, and was more presidential than Donald Trump last night. I mean, I got a text from a Republican while watching the debate last night that I'm watching Trump implode right now. It's a really bad night for Trump. And so, I think that it's not just people like you and I who think that Trump isn't.
I got a text from somebody who, by the way, I know to be, he's a friend, but he was a contributor to Rick Becker's campaign, right? I mean, he's a right-wing dude, and he texted me last night, embarrassed to be a Republican tonight. He appears unhinged.
Yeah, and now it doesn't matter, right? I mean, how much is the cake already baked on this thing? I mean, I saw some focus groups last night when I got home of, independent or undecideds moving towards Kamala. I mean, I think what she needed to do was show people that she's presidential. I think she did that last night. Yeah. I think she masterfully got under his skin. Like, that was clearly, and they said it going in, that they were going to try to get just bringing up crowd sizes at the beginning, and the guy just spirals for the next 90 minutes.
Yeah, I think she did. And I'm saying this as somebody who's not enthusiastic about Kamala Harris. I don't think she's a particularly strong presidential candidate. I think there's a reason she's running neck and neck with Donald Trump. Some of it has to do with her. Some of it has to do with the fact that Democrats have to figure out how to appeal to a broader swath of the American electorate. But even so, I think in that respect, you're right. I mean, she called him weak. I mean, Donald Trump he has this persona of like hyper masculinity, and she attacked it, and he did not take it well, and that was terrible. And then you had the thing about the immigrants or Haitian refugees or what have you, supposedly eating people's pets or whatever, which I shouldn't need to say this, but I'm gonna say it. It is not true. And I don't even like the word. Some people are saying it's unfounded, suggesting that like, oh, it could be happening, but
just unfounded. Yeah.
No, it's not happening. There's not, and I realize that maybe you could find an anecdote of some crazy person who killed somebody's cat, and I'm gonna tell you, you could find all sorts of headlines about Americans doing all sorts of crazy things, and that cuts across every line from the super rich to the super poor and every race and ethnicity and religious background and gender that you can think of. So, it's not happening. But he's saying it, and I wrote a column about it this morning in the context of the term blood libel kept coming through my mind. And the reason why is it's because it's probably the most egregious example of history of a concerted effort over the course of more than 1,000 years of targeting a specific group of people, in this case Jews, and saying with just a pernicious lie, with the intent of isolating them and villainizing them and ultimately persecuting them. And a lot of times just as a political vehicle, right? To gain popularity with a certain section of the public. And I feel like that's what this is, right? And it's not that far of a leap. The QAnon conspiracy theories, which Trump routinely panders to on social media. He posts their tropes and their slogans, and and on his Truth Social thing, he promotes it. I mean, they're the ones who think that Hollywood elites, which, what's in, if you're in conspiracy land, who controls Hollywood? Oh, the Jews. The Hollywood elite are kidnapping children to extract adrenochrome from them. Well, that's just an updated version of the blood libel, which holds that Jewish people, rabbis or whatnot, would kidnap Christians, particularly kidnap Christian children and use their blood in rituals. Like this, it's the same thing. This is a tale as old as time, and he's doing it again. Now it's Haitians eating dogs or eating cats or whatever the stupid thing is. And it's just, that's what it is. And the thing is, I don't even think that Donald Trump believes it. I don't think that J.D. Vance believes it. But I think they know that there's a section of people that they want to reach who are titillated by it, and so they're going to say it.
Rob, I don't know how conservatives listen to that debate last night and think Trump's our guy. Do you recall when he was asked, do you want Ukraine to win the war over Russia? Twice, and he couldn't answer the question if he wanted Ukraine to win the war over Russia. Do you remember him talking about, is it Orban, the Hungarian strongman?
Viktor Orban, yep.
Yeah, who he's propping up like the greatest world leader.
Who, by the way, addressed CPAC. And by the way, CPAC has held events in Hungary.
Right. He talked about January 6th, that it was people on his side that got killed, not on the other side, ignoring the fact that there's police officers that died. I don't know as a conservative how you can support the guy who thinks the cops were wrong on January 6th. Support the guy who wants Russia to win the war, or at least can't say Ukraine should win the war, and supports these dictators around the world who stand for things that we are against and still can't decide if we won or lost the election in 2020. It was absolutely off the rails where he was coming from.
And even just it's not even coherent. Like, it'd be one thing if he's just taking bad positions, but his positions aren't even coherent, because out of one side of his mouth, he's saying, oh, I'm the strong man, right? I'm the strong man, and Vladimir Putin's so scared of me, and he was so scared of me, he didn't do any of this stuff. Okay, but if that's a reflection of your true feelings about Vladimir Putin, that he is a villain who needs to be checked, then why can't you just say, I want him to lose in Ukraine? Why can't you just say that?
And again, one of the things that was interesting about listening to just the audio is that exact thing. I mean, we hear so much about Joe Biden was old and incoherent and all these things, and he had his moments, there's no doubt. I don't know how you listen to that debate or watch that debate last night and think, oh, this guy's got it together. We want him at the switch. We want him at the, making with the nuclear codes. I don't know how you do that, because he was not stable at all. The other thing that I think Kamala did really effectively in the clips that I saw is almost like can you believe this guy? Like, sort of.
I was going to say that you've obviously watched the clips since. I was going to say that was one thing that you missed only listening to the audio was her facial expressions, which wasn't. I mean, I think you have to be careful with something like that, because it can come up as too theatric or too contrived. We've seen candidates in the past do like big exaggerated eye rolls and stuff, and it comes off as almost kind of cartoonish. I thought she kind of handled it well. Like, her facial expressions to me seemed authentic.
Right. And at times felt bad for him. Like, you lost the election in 2020 and you're clearly having a tough time dealing with that. Like, almost like there, little guy, like speaking down to him, like feeling sorry for him at times. I mean, she seemed bigger and stronger than he did. But not in like an angry way, right? She had to be careful about that. She's a woman. She's an African-American woman. She had to be careful about that. I just thought she performed last night and clearly took the debate much more seriously than he did. You mentioned Lindsey Graham. I heard he's calling for the people who did debate prep to get fired. The problem is not the people who are doing debate prep. The problem was a candidate.
Yeah, the problem wasn't the moderators either. That's been the other big talking point is, it was 3-on-1. And I mean, listen, as a conservative, I could see, and I work in the news media, and I could see there aren't a lot of people who see the world like I do who work in the news media. They're just, on more like policy issues, right? Like, we agree on big stuff like First Amendment. and facts. But, you know, when it starts coming down to, I mean, I look at the way some of my journalist friends and colleagues, mostly in the national media, I look at the way sometimes they write about places like North Dakota, or they talk about issues, and they have a hard time understanding the conservative perspective. I think that is a real problem in the news media. That being said, I don't have a problem with the moderators fact-checking Donald Trump when he says that Haitian people are eating pets when that's not happening.
Right. I mean, and I was impressed by the moderators last night because they were doing the fact-checking and going, like, do you want Russia to lose the war? They went back to that. And so just simple up and down, you know, like they went back to the things and pushed him. Often he wouldn't answer the questions. But the other thing, his healthcare plan. I mean, the fact that he said we're still working on the concepts of a healthcare plan, it's like you've been running for president for nearly a decade and you still don't know what you stand for in terms of healthcare.
Nobody in the last decade, nobody has been president of the United States more than Donald Trump. It don't know. It kind of floors me that, I mean, that was my question in the column about the blood libel stuff. It's just, hey, fellow Republicans, fellow conservatives, is this worth it to you? Like, is it like this is what we have to endure to avoid what? A Harris-Walz administration that is probably going to be more hostile to domestic energy production than we would like, even though I don't think they're nearly as hostile as some would like us to believe. And by the way, I thought Harris did some great things, revealing the fact that she's a gun owner. I thought was very smart. Like I feel like the left has made a terrible mistake by casting gun owners as weirdos.
Right.
I guess they kind of use like they're not weird. Gun ownership is very common in the United States. Most gun owners own their guns responsibly, use their guns responsibly, and are not criminals. And yeah, the guy who feels like he has to pack heat in the produce aisle, yeah, he's a weirdo. But everybody else, I just, you know, I feel like that has been so needed from Democrats, is just to drop some of the culture war stuff, be Americans like the rest. And that's a terrible way of putting it, because I'm not trying to be insulting. I think you understand what I'm trying to say.
I do. Well, and it's the very reason, Rob, why most gun owners support things like background checks, right? Because they're responsible gun owners. Left, right, center. People who own guns. And I mean, I'm just thinking through my brain, all the liberals I know that are sportsmen and go out hunting and, you know, all the different things. So yeah, I agree. I was a little, I knew Tim Walz obviously was shoots pheasants and that kind of thing. I was not aware of that for her. I also, here's the thing.
By the way, I wouldn't, it doesn't, now that I think about it, it doesn't surprise me. There's a lot of prosecutors who have concealed carry license because of what they do for a living. They put dangerous criminals in jail. And, you know, I mean, if it wouldn't surprise me to learn that Kamala Harris, and maybe she's kept it to herself because that's not probably very a popular thing with the progressive base. But the idea that she would have a concealed carry weapons permit, if that is in fact she does, and I don't know if she does or not, it wouldn't surprise me, given her job.
Well, and I know that like Trump and others have tried to beat the hell out of her for switching her position on fracking. I don't know about you, but I'm happy she changed her position on fracking. That she's no longer
please come to the middle.
It's a good thing for a country, for this part of the country as well. You know, it's harder for Trump to flip-flop on things because he's taken 52 different stands on every issue that's out there, right? I mean, he just came out in favor of legalization in Florida. He's taken several positions on the abortion ban that's on the ballot in Florida. I don't know. I mean, it's so underwhelming, his performance. And again, if you're concerned about Biden's age and Biden's ability to do the job, and then you look at Donald Trump and say, this guy's got it, I think there's something wrong.
So the one thing that, because you just said about, Trump's been flip-flopping all over the place, his kind of superpower, and this is what worries me about, I mean, you and I look at this, this guy is clearly unfit. He has the wrong priorities. He thinks the people who attacked Congress on January 6th are patriots. Like, this is just wrong. You and I see that. I think so many people have just become a nerd at that, and they kind of quote and say, yeah, Trump flip-flops, he's Trump, or yeah, Trump says horrible things, he's Trump. And And it's like he gets away with it. It's other politicians get held to a different standard. Even other Republican politicians get held to a different standard, not just by the media or whatever, but by the base, right? I mean, I don't think that someone like a Ted Cruz or a Marco Rubio could get away with flip-flopping on abortion the way Donald Trump does, but Donald Trump is this singular figure in American politics, so he gets away with it. And I think that's what makes it, when you point out, like he's committing a blood libel against Haitian people. It's ugly and it's horrible and it's stupid, but he gets away with it because it's like, it's Trump.
Could you imagine if, when we moderated the debate between Katrina Christensen and Kevin Cramer, if Kevin Cramer showed up and said the stuff that Trump said last night, the local media would be writing columns, what has happened to Kevin Cramer? What is wrong with Kevin Cramer? Because Kevin Cramer's, like, these guys who support Trump are better at this than Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so, like, again, I think you're absolutely right. The media, everybody sort of lets him off the hook. That's just Trump being Trump. At some point, God bless us, I hope that people see through this.
Speaking of Katrina Christensen and Trump, that ad that she cut I wrote about it this week. The ad that she released featuring a Trump voter who says that he's going to vote for her, pretty savvy. That's a W. That was pretty good. Is it going to win her the election? Probably not. But
listen, if you're running in a state where Trump has a 60 to 65 approval rating, and 52%, 55% of people identify as Republicans, you better do something like that. I think is a really smart move by her team.
I have to say how much fun I had reporting that story too, because I actually spoke to the Tomac brothers. And the reason why I say brothers is the first thing that I noticed was Frank Tomac. I saw the last name and I thought, oh, well, there was a Tomac who was a Democratic state lawmaker and showed up on a lot of Democratic campaign finance disclosures over the years. And I thought, well, he must be part of the same family. And obviously I knew other people would recognize. So I wanted to give that context, to the ad to say, he does have a brother, also from the understanding that politics are personal and he doesn't have to agree with his brother. So I called Steve. I talked to Steve Tomac first. And his first thing was like, well, who the hell remembers that I served in the legislature? And it's like,
well, Steve, there weren't that many Democrats.
Yeah. So. Well, but he was done in 2001. In his era, there were a lot more.
Yeah, that's true.
Democrats.
Have we really been since 2001? Oh my God, I feel old right now.
He left the legislature in 2001. I think he was first, because he served in the House and the Senate. I don't know what order, but I think he was first elected in the 80s.
Yeah.
And then he served in the House for a while and the Senate for a while.
2000, there's some redistricting stuff where he and Crowder ended up in the same district.
Something like that, yeah. But so first of all, he's like, well, who the hell? And he goes, he said, well, I wasn't aware of my brother's, presidential politics. I knew that he'd had Katrina down to because I guess, first of all, they have like 17 siblings.
Yeah, with a family of that size, you probably got, of that size, you got the full political spectrum, I would imagine.
Probably. But he said he knew he had Katrina down. And Katrina actually, so from her campaign spokesperson, Carrie Billings, he said that Katrina had gone out to, Frank Tomac is the president of the Independent Beef Association. And so she'd gone out and talked to her board. It's a bunch of ranchers, so pretty tough audience for a Democrat. But she kind of became buddies with Frank. And then Frank, they eventually talked him into, appearing in an ad because he liked her. And when I talked to Frank, he said, I'm the better looking brother. I'm the one who still got shit on his boots. And he goes, I'm definitely on the other side of the fence for him politically, except when it comes to Katrina Christensen. So anyway,
Rob, did you write that Katrina went down and helped inseminate cattle as well?
She did.
How badass is that?
Well, I don't know that badass is the word I'd use for it. But it's,
you ever inseminated cattle?
No,
I haven't either.
I am so glad that ranchers do what they do. I would not want to do that part of the job. But it was a very colorful anecdote from the campaign trail. So that was kind of a fun. I mean, that again, that's a win. That's a good ad. That's a savvy ad. It's got a great backstory to it. That's a win for Katrina Christensen. I still don't think she's going to win in November, but good ad.
She's doing a good job.
She's really a good job. She really is. So yeah, that was interesting. I don't know if there's anything else we can hit on real quick or that we need to hit on. I do have a great story out about a district court judge, Cherie Clark in Cass County, making some comments in open court about her frustration of being able to find treatment and be able to find evaluations in North Dakota's Health and Human Services. That story is definitely worth your time to read. But very interesting stuff. And that's it for today. Coming up on Friday, we're going to have the Measure 4 debate. Robert Harms, longtime Republican in North Dakota, is going to make the case against Measure 4. Making the case for Measure 4 is former Fargo City Commissioner Tony Gehrig, so tune in for that. Thank you so much for listening. That's it for today on Plain Talk, the voice of North Dakota politics. Plain Talk is a production of Forum Communications Company. Got a question, comment, or suggestion? Send me an email at rport@forumcom.com. That's forumcom with 2 M's.com. If you haven't subscribed to Plain Talk yet, you can find us on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts. For those of you who are already hooked, give us a rating or review. And don't forget to share or tell a friend. Special thanks to my co-host Chad Oban, and from myself and everyone at Plain Talk, thanks for listening. Yeah, the guy who feels like he has to pack heat in the produce aisle, he's a weirdo.